okay? This is being recorded because there's such a demand for this to be distributed throughout the entire world. Thank you all for coming tonight, and welcome to, is this working? Okay. Welcome to the restart of the Great Issues Forums at Redeemer. We started this event 2 a year in 2016, and for 2 years we were unable to do them. So this is the 9th Great Issues Forum, and we've covered topics from LGBTQ rights to immigration to policing and implicit bias training. So we've had a broad range of topics. And tonight, we're having speakers on what is important to all of us. I don't think one person has walked in here who I know who hasn't said, oh my God, I'm scared about the election in a month. And I think we're all feeling the risk to our democracy. We had planned for the 2 years that we missed to do at least 2 sessions on climate change. And we wanted to do one that focuses locally, like what you can do, and one that gives a broad brush. And so that's probably what you're going to see us doing the next time. But in your pews, there's a little piece of paper and a little wee pencil. If you have ideas of topics that you'd like us to cover, please note them down, because we have a group of 8 of us on the committee, and we get together and decide on the topic. And also, if you would like to get notification of each forum, put your name on that piece of paper, or there's a place to put it on in the back where you can be on the email list, and you'll receive the announcements each time we have another forum. Tonight, Joe Mertz is going to be, he got these guys together, and he is going to introduce them and run the session. So thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Pat. And it's actually the whole committee did pull this together, and Pat Getty and I sort of made the initial contact. So welcome this evening. Tonight's topic is democracy threatened, will your vote count? There was a time when I naively understood democracy was being very simple, and it would be nice to say I was naive when I was like 12, but I was like 55 at the time. Everybody gets a vote, they count all the votes, everybody gets, and whoever gets the most votes win. But as has become obvious in the last several years, voting is not that simple. There are many questions of who gets to vote, how can they vote, how can their vote be challenged, and with what others will their vote be pulled towards electing a representative, and many more. It's hard to ignore the messages that are being bombarding us by people of all views that we should think about these issues. Our goal tonight is not to have a debate. Our goal is to better inform ourselves by hearing from our 2 experts who are deeply embedded in the issues of voting, who can explain to us in a less partisan way what these issues are and how we can think about them ourselves. And hopefully not just think about, but what we can do beyond voting to help support this aspect of our democracy. So as Pat said, please note we will be recording this forum. Our first speaker is Jonathan Cervas. Jonathan is a postdoctoral fellow at Carnegie Mellon, where he teaches for the Institute of Politics and Strategy. He joins the Institute in 2020 after receiving his PhD in political science from the University of California, Irvine. His 2020 doctoral dissertation is titled A Quantitative Assessment of the Electoral College, 1790 to 2020. His research is focused on the inequalities in American political institutions and how they produce disparity among voters. He has assisted 3 federal courts in voting rights and redistricting cases related to redistricting and racial minority voting rights. He served as a redistricting consultant to the Pennsylvania Legislature Reappointment Commission in 2021, and most recently he served in the New York State Supreme Court as a special master, redrawing the state Senate and Congressional districts. And as he told me when we met over coffee, in any given state, it's either the left or the right hates him. And so he's equal opportunity hated in that way. So, Jonathan.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. Everybody here okay? Okay, good. Let me start by first just, reiterating that we're 27 days away from an election, a midterm election. And people often say that the next election is the most important in our lives. And we say that about every election, right? And it's true. The next election is the most important. So the next election is extremely important here on November 8th. If you're not yet registered to vote, though I suspect everybody here is, you must register in the state of Pennsylvania by October 24th. And you can register online if you haven't at pavoterservices.pa.gov. And you can also plan to vote by mail if you'd like. And the deadline for receiving a ballot to do by mail is November 1st. And you have to go online and actually tell the state that you want a ballot if you want to vote that way. If you decide to vote by mail, it's important to know that your ballot must be received by election night at 5 o'clock. And I just want to say, make sure that you sign it and date it and put it in all the envelopes as required by law, so that there's no question about the legality of your vote. And another quick comment on mail-in voting, since it's been a little bit controversial over the last 2 years. Mail-in voting is nothing new. It goes by another name, absentee voting. You may have heard of that. It's been going on since the 1800s. We've had absentee voting. So there's nothing new or necessarily controversial about mail-in voting. Of course, we received the universal mail-in voting in Pennsylvania, the ability for any individual to request a ballot to be cast that way in 2019 from Act 77, which was passed on a bipartisan basis with unanimous Republican support in the state Senate, and almost all House Republicans voted to bring mail-in balloting to Pennsylvania. Governor Wolf, in his signing statement for Act 77, said that Pennsylvania ranks 25th for voter participation, with only 51% of the eligible population participating in the 2018 election. That's very disappointing for a state that has as much political power as Pennsylvania has. We're notoriously competitive and have these elections that are decisive in our federal elections. And so being ranked at only the midpoint is not so good. And one more note on mail-in balloting, and this is more of a pessimistic take on mail-in ballot. It is the least secure way that you can vote. The most secure way of voting is to go in person, where there is an election administrator there to ensure your vote is cast and counted fully and effectively. That's not to say that mail-in balloting is somehow fraud. There's very little reason to believe that your vote won't be counted. But lots of things can go wrong when you put it in a mailbox. Somebody can steal it, the mailman can forget to deliver it. And so the best way to guarantee you that your vote is cast is to do it in person. But I say that, not suggesting that you shouldn't vote by mail. It certainly is, in America, found to be very secure. So let me move on to the topic that I am most interested in. And I just realized I forgot to set my 15-minute timer, so now Joe needs to remind me when I run out of time. And that is partisan gerrymandering. So my work in academia has been on the subject of redistricting and the Electoral College, but we're not in a presidential election. But we are in a season where the redistricting cycle has just ended, or at least it's just begun, since there'll be many court cases over the next 10 years. But we have redone all the districts all over the country, and that has profound effects on on who's able to win office in America. So let me first quote from a couple of quotes from a court case from the 1960s, a court case called Reynolds versus Sims. And I think this sort of is expressive of what our democracy is. It says, "The right to elect legislators in a free and unimpaired fashion is the bedrock of our political system." And the court goes on to say, logically, in a society ostensibly grounded on representative government, it would seem reasonable that a majority of the people of a state could elect a majority of the state's legislators. To conclude differently and to sanction minority control of state legislative bodies would appear to deny majority rights in a way that far surpasses any possible denial of minority rights that might otherwise be thought to result. And so I say this because that's exactly what partisan gerrymandering is. Now, they weren't talking about partisan gerrymandering in these cases. They were talking about malapportionment, which is when districts were of unequal sizes. But the court determined in the 1960s that those were not allowed under the principle of one person, one vote. Every one of us has a vote that is equal to every other vote. But here we are in 2022, and we still have votes that are being diluted. We have minority votes, racial minority votes being diluted, and we have partisan votes that are being diluted. So thinking about Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania is, the consummate swing state, right? So it voted for Trump in 2016, it voted for Biden in 2020. When we look at our statewide elections in the executive branch, 2 of the current executives are Democrats, Governor Wolf and Attorney General Shapiro. They're both Democrats. And 2, the 4 in Garrity are Republicans. Those are the Auditor General and the Treasurer. And they're all elected statewide. Of our U.S. senators, 1 is a Democrat and 1 is a Republican. And of the 6 current Supreme Court justices, 4 of them were elected as Democrats and 2 of them were elected as Republicans. So in sum, the state is basically evenly distributed between Democrats and Republicans when they're elected statewide. It's a swing state. It's a battleground. So let's rewind to 2011. 2011, Republicans controlled both branches of both chambers of the state legislature and the governorship. That meant that they had full control over the redistricting process for drawing congressional districts in Pennsylvania. They drew a plan that resulted in 13 Republican seats and 5 Democratic seats. And that was regardless of what the vote outcomes were. So when the Democrats were able to win a majority of the votes across the state, they were still only winning 5 of the 18 seats. And when Democrats won more votes, they never gained any seats. In other words, it was biased and it was unresponsive to the changes in voter preferences. In 2018, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court heard a court case called the League of Women Voters versus the Commonwealth. This was the very first time in the history of the United States where a state court overturned a congressional map because of partisan gerrymandering. So the federal courts are unwilling to police partisan gerrymandering. They've said it's a political question that is best left to the states and that it's out of reach of the federal judiciary. But instead, the Pennsylvania State Court looked to our own Constitution and the provisions that require that elections be free and equal, and said that that congressional plan, which again resulted in a disproportionate result, was unconstitutional and must be replaced. They said it dilutes the votes of those who in prior elections voted for the party not in power to give the party in power a lasting electoral advantage. The court also recognized that voters should not have their votes diluted based on where they live. And the court ultimately ruled that those plans had to be replaced, and they did so with a court-drawn map. That map, redrawn by the court by a neutral academic party, resulted in the next 2 elections, both where the Republicans and Democrats got approximately the same number of votes, in 9 Democratic seats and 9 Republican seats, exactly as one would expect, given the election results. So now we've had a new census data after 2020, as required by the U.S. Constitution. And when we had our final population counts, it turns out that Pennsylvania was going to lose 1 congressional district. So we were going to go down from 18 to 17. This is a trend that has continued over the last 50 or 60 years as the population has either declined or not kept pace with the rest of the country. And there, now, the difference between 2011 and 2021 is that the Republicans no longer hold a trifecta in our government. Governor Wolf had veto power over a potential map. And the legislature drew a map that was biased towards the Republicans, and Governor Wolf vetoed it. And ultimately, our state Supreme Court once again had to place their own map, this time selecting a map drawn by another neutral academic. That map has not been used yet, but it's seen by those of us who follow these things as being ostensibly fair. And the court said in that court case that consideration of partisan fairness when selecting a plan among several that meet core traditional criteria is necessary to ensure that a redistricting plan is reflective and responsive to the partisan preferences of the Commonwealth's voters. So we are going to be voting in 2022 on congressional districts that are free, equal, and are not going to dilute your vote. This is an optimistic thing. So for all those who came in pessimistic about election, there's something optimistic to be. And let me, I don't know how much time I have, but let me say something quickly about, I only got 10 minutes left? Oh, wow, I talk so fast.
We're at 10 minutes, you got at least 5.
Okay, great. So I want to talk just briefly about the state legislature in Pennsylvania. I was fortunate enough to team up with an all-star team at the state capitol led by Mark Nortenberg, former chancellor of the University of Pittsburgh, and our general counsel, Rob Beyer, who's a former judge on the Commonwealth Court, and others on our team. And I was a consultant to the commission that was tasked with drawing those districts. The commission is a political commission with both leaders of the state Senate and both leaders of the state House of Representatives. So that's 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and then the neutral chair, who of course, again, was Mark Nortenberg. And so looking at what we were tasked with, reapportioning the state, we want to take a look at what happened again in the previous decade. Though this commission is supposed to be neutral and fair because of the tie-breaking vote, that's not what happened in 2011. In fact, there was litigation that overturned the plan the commission had delivered then and was replaced in the state Senate with one in 2013 that wasn't much better. But these were plans that by any regard, any expert would say were partisan gerrymanders. Your vote has been diluted for at least the past decade for the state legislature. If you're a Democrat, you have not been given an equal chance to elect the candidates that you prefer. And the numbers are clear. Remember, the state is 50-50. It's unequivocal that this is a 50-50 state. And so you expect the legislature to also be 50-50. But instead, right now, there are 28 Republican state Senate seats to only 21 held by the Democrats, and 1 independent who caucuses with the Republicans. And that advantage is actually lower than what it was earlier in the decade when the state Senate had a super majority for the Republicans. They had a 33-16 majority after the 2016 election. Again, an election that was almost exactly 50-50 statewide. Similarly, in the state House, there are currently 113 seats that are held by Republicans to just 90 held by the Democrats. And this, too, is a narrowed majority. It was 120 to 79 after the 2016 election. And so what we were able to accomplish while we did this reapportionment was that we drew maps that are much, much more likely to result in the party that wins the majority of the votes also winning the majority of the seats. So that means that your vote is now undiluted in the Congress and it's undiluted in the state legislature. So I've got a couple more things that I have on my mind about this coming election unrelated to partisan gerrymandering, but I am going to stop and pass it on to Jessie, who's going to be introduced by Joe.
Thank you very much. So our second speaker is sorry about that. Our second speaker is Jessie Allen. Jessie's a professor of law at the University of Pittsburgh, where she teaches we're going by that one. Property, legal ethics,
Legal philosophy.
and a course on justice as performance. Prior to joining the Legal Academy, Professor Allen worked for several national public interest organizations and briefly at the U.S. Department of Justice, where she was a Bristow Fellow in the Office of the Solicitor General. Professor Allen's interest in voting rights dates from her litigation practice. As a senior attorney for Advancement Project, a racial justice organization, she litigated voting rights cases in swing states during the 2008 presidential election. Before that, she was a staff attorney at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law, where she focused on challenging state laws that bar voting because of criminal conviction. She's also an author of a long-running weblog, Blackstone Weekly. Jessie.
Thanks, and thanks for having me. I second the, excitement, concern about the upcoming election. Oh, let me turn my timer on. So that I'm glad that we're doing this. I took a look at the title of the talk, Democracy Threatened, Will Your Vote Count? And I thought, all right, let me sort of try to structure this way. So I thought of 3 big ways that I think democracy can be threatened, perhaps is threatened, and those 3 big ways that your vote might not count and that you might need to try to think of what to do to prevent that. So the first of these ways, to me, has to do with big picture election structures and voter qualifications. And these are the kinds of things that I worked on when I was a voting rights attorney for national organizations, right? And one of these big picture structures, Jonathan's just been talking about, redistricting and gerrymandering, right? Ways in which we structure, rather than just having an election where everybody votes, for everything, we have this idea that voting is connected to geographical locations, and then you have to draw lines somewhere between those, and as soon as you get a choice about where to draw lines, you have a choice that could affect, theoretically anyway, the opportunities of certain kinds of candidates, whether by race or by party, to succeed within the lines that you draw, right? So that's an electoral structure that could dilute the power of your vote if it puts you in a district with so many other people who are bound to vote against the candidate you're going to vote for. There goes your vote. Another big structure that I worked on, you heard, was felony disenfranchisement. Many different states have different rules about criminal convictions' effect on your right to vote. This is something that in other countries, by the way, is not usually taken for granted or done at all. I mean, we have a basic idea in most states in the US that criminal conviction, temporarily anyway, affects your right to vote. It doesn't have to, and in fact, there are 2 states where it doesn't at all, Vermont and Maine, as well as in Puerto Rico. People can vote from prison in those states. In most, and that's true in most European countries, it's true in England, it's not an oddball idea. But in our country, we have a few states where not only can you not vote from prison or not vote if you're on probation on some kind of supervision, but once you are convicted of a felony, you can never vote again as long as you live. And Florida is one of those states, and there are over 1 million people in Florida who are disenfranchised by that law. We challenged that law as a violation of the Constitution, as a violation of the Federal Voting Rights Act. We lost, which tells you something about the different view that the federal courts have about the way these structures work. You can't count on a notion that because you have a sort of overarching sense of justice, that's going to line up with the history of court decisions, even in a post-civil rights era United States, right? Anyway, I could go on about felony disenfranchisement for a very long time. Luckily, Pennsylvania has a much more liberal law, although in my view not liberal enough. In Pennsylvania, you're disenfranchised only for a felony conviction when you're incarcerated in prison. As soon as you get out, you're able to re-register or register for the first time and vote again. But that doesn't mean that Pennsylvania has all great structural laws or always has. I mean, about a decade ago, a voter ID law was passed. Now, voter ID laws exist in many states, and they tend to disenfranchise people who are poor, who don't have government ID, and who don't drive cars, because a classic form of voter ID is a driver's license. So if you happen to live in a city and not have a car, then you're less likely to have that variation. Anyway, about 10 years ago, Pennsylvania passed such a law, but it was challenged by the ACLU and by another organization I used to work for, Advancement Project, and they won. And that law was struck down. So, you know, what can you do about these kinds of laws, right? Well, you can support the organizations that fight them. You can stay up to date on proposed legislation and advocate against it, make phone calls, you know, do the best you can on that score. But the truth is, you're not going to have individually a lot of effect on those big structural issues other than coming out in support, I think, of groups that fight them, and in, again, advocating with your own representatives against them. Now, let me say that sometimes new structures appear that don't cut down voting, they expand it, right? They expand access, and mail-in voting in Pennsylvania, no excuse mail-in voting that came in the 2019 law, is one of those good time optimistic stories, right? There we got a structural change that greatly expanded the ability of people to vote. It didn't enfranchise new kinds of voters, but it made it possible for people who otherwise wouldn't be able to vote. People who, for example, have the kind of jobs where they're called on election day to go to work in an emergency room at a fire station, and they don't know in advance whether or not election day is going to be a day when they're working, when there's a fire, right? But if there is, they can't show up at their polling place. So before we had no excuse voting in Pennsylvania, those people were out of luck because they weren't one of the categories of people who could have a good absentee excuse for not voting, right? Now, though, they can anticipate, well, maybe I won't be able to vote, so I'll request a mail-in ballot and I'll vote by mail ahead of time. That way it's taken care of. What was I? Sorry, I got lost track on my notes here. All right, so as Jonathan said, mail-in balloting, it's nothing new. In fact, again, we had absentee balloting here in Pennsylvania, meaning if you had an excuse, you could order a mail-in ballot. Now we have wide open, no excuse balloting, and it was a bipartisan issue that was passed. It was good news. Again, it's not odd. There are 28 states that have no excuse mail-in balloting, and they had it before Pennsylvania, so we were really behind the curve. Not only that, there's 5 states, and they're not all blue states, that conduct almost their entire election by mail and have for a long time. Those are Colorado, Hawaii, Oregon, Washington, and Utah. Again, not known for its huge Democratic majority, right? They've been doing mail-in balloting, no excuse mail-in balloting for years. So, again, you can advocate for these kinds of structural changes, support them, support the organizations. But the deal is, so here's my second way that your vote might not count and democracy can be threatened. Even if you have relatively fair and open voting structures, you can still find yourself disenfranchised if those structures are being administered in a discriminatory, arbitrary, or even just a sloppy and ignorant way, right? So, I don't know, how many people here are poll workers? Yes! See, this is a relatively large, all right, you know the story, right? You're there at the poll, somebody shows up, and they have a problem, they have a question. With the new mail-in ballots, You've ordered a mail-in ballot, but when you started to fill it out, you messed something up. Now what are you going to do? Well, the rule is if you bring the ballot and the secrecy envelope and the mailer to your polling place, you are allowed to vote a regular ballot, not a provisional ballot that might or might not count, but a regular ballot. The judge of elections has got to look at it, has got to like fill out a form, make you sign it, it's all kinds of stuff. But then you get to vote regular ballot. Well, all your fellow poll workers might not know that. Or maybe they're really busy and they don't want to stop and fill out that affidavit and go through this whole thing. They want to just hand you, or the person with a provisional ballot. Just go vote that, which they're not as good, trust me. Anyway, because they don't count till after the election. There you are, you're a poll worker, you know that you can do that, right? But it can also get messed up by people who either don't know that, don't want to be bothered, or who, unfortunately, are, perhaps choosing in a not entirely fair manner who they are going to go the extra mile for to help vote and who they're going to just say, forget about it. So what can you do? You can be a poll worker, right? Or you can get your kids or your grandkids to be poll workers. High school students can be poll workers. They get paid. They learn about democracy. It's a great job. I've done it, and it's a way to actually be there on site, be informed, and be sure that at least at that level, your vote and the votes of all the people who are in the district that you're taking care of count. Another aspect of this, you can bump it up a notch, would be county election administration. You might have heard on the news yesterday that the United States Supreme Court struck down a lower federal court ruling that had made a rule, again, to do with the sort of nitty-gritty administration of mail-in ballots. And what it was a ruling that said you can't not count ballots just because somebody doesn't write on the line that says date on the outside mailer the date that they're sending the thing back. There was a court case about it. Again, it was an ACLU case, and they managed to challenge this under a federal law, federal civil rights law, passed during the civil rights era, the era of, literacy tests and all kinds of phony, baloney ways of disenfranchising people. This Federal Civil Rights Act says it's against federal law to not count somebody's vote because of some kind of trivial, typographical, non-substantive mistake, right? So there's a rule in mail-in balloting that's part of the law that says this mail-in ballot's going to have on the exterior a line where the voter writes the date that they're sending it back. But it's not ID information. It's not their birth date, though, by the way, it's really confusing, and some people write their birth date on it. It's just, this is the date I'm sending it back. Well, the thing is going to be postmarked, and in any case, it only counts if it's received at the county election office by election day. So this date has no substantive value at all, and it's ambiguous. So a federal court held, yeah, that would violate this federal civil rights law that says you can't disenfranchise people for that reason. Well, not according to 5 justices on the United States Supreme Court who vacated that ruling. Okay, but now wait a minute. Here's where administration triumphs. All that did was take away a federal court ruling that you must count the date. It's not a decision by the United States Supreme Court saying, rather, that you mustn't disenfranchise for an absent date, right? That was the federal ruling. You can't not count the ballot because the date is missing, right? The court strikes this down. That leaves it open to the state election administration to decide, do you count ballots with the date or not? The federal law has got nothing to say about it, according to the US Supreme Court. That ruling doesn't count. Well, the current Secretary of State, who's acting, says, we think you do have to count, or you do have to count it, even if somebody doesn't fill out the date. So the current guidance is from the state, counties, you all have to count these ballots, even if the person doesn't write in the date. But look how messed up I'm getting even just talking about it, right? I mean, do you really think every county election administrator is going to be clear about that? I don't know. My guess is some of those ballots are going to be counted and some are not. So again, it's a matter of like, so what can we do? Well, try to pay attention to who it is who's doing that. If there are elections for the kinds of people who oversee those things, which there are in some states, and honestly, I don't know enough about Pennsylvania to know how that works, you got to pay attention to that stuff too, right? But this brings me to, you know, why all the uproar and why all these court actions about mail-in balloting in Pennsylvania in the first place, right? When you heard from Jonathan what's true, that this law was passed. It was one of the most bipartisan. It wasn't just bipartisan. Every single Pennsylvania state senator, Republican and Democratic, voted yes on this bill. And every single member of the state lower house, Republican and Democratic, with one exception, voted yes for this bill. And then all of a sudden, 2 years later, there's all this antagonism, including a lawsuit filed by some 12 state representatives who voted for the bill, challenging its constitutionality, right? What's up with this? How is this happening? Well, it's that, what Rick Housing calls, the fraudulent fraud squad at work, right? And this is the story that this is my third way that your vote could be made to not count, or that your vote could not count and democracy is threatened. And that's basically misinformation and false information and false stories about what's what. So another way that your vote could be made not to count is if stuff gets rolling based on a lot of misinformation, or for that matter, if you yourself are targeted with misinformation and as a result vote for or against someone or something because you didn't get the straight story, right? This can happen. I mean, I don't know if you heard the story on NPR this morning about targeted advertising. I mean, you know your Facebook thread, right? Walmart can do it. You know, you shop somewhere for a sofa and suddenly there are 10 ads for sofas on your feed, right? Guess what? Politics can do it too. That's what the Russians did, by the way, in 2016. You're an African American voter, here's a piece of misinformation about the candidates, just made for you, the kind of thing we think you might believe. You're a gray-haired white law professor, here's something we have for you. So it absolutely comes across. And another aspect of this, of course, is the death of local journalism that does away with a trustworthy, somewhat, broad across the political spectrum source of news about local information. So, you've got this potential for being targeted by false information or for having enough of your fellow citizens targeted by it and motivated to act on it that it winds up completely skewing the choices that are available to you, right? I mean, just on this fraud story, let me give you a few talking points in case you run into some benighted person who believes it. Mail-in ballots. So I told you that 5 states have been running their entire elections by mail for some time, number of years. So the New York Times, which I think is all the news that's fit to print, says that states that use vote by mail have encountered essentially zero fraud. Oregon, the pioneer in this area, I'm quoting this from the Times, if there's anyone from the Times present, I'm giving you credit. Oregon, the pioneer in this area, has sent out more than 100 million mail-in ballots since 2000 and has documented only about a dozen cases of proven fraud. An exhaustive investigative journalism analysis of all known voter fraud cases identified only 491 cases of absentee ballot fraud from 2000 to 2012. That's 12 years, all over the country. That's what? Billions of votes, right? Literally billions of votes. Less than 500 cases of fraud, all right? Your chances, this is also the Times, no, this is the Brennan Center. It is still more likely, well, I mean, first of all, let me say this. Back when I was in the voting qualification, voting rights game, it is true that despite those low numbers, absentee and mail-in balloting is more likely, more susceptible to fraud than in-person fraud. I mean, that's why the voter ID thing is a complete insanity, right? Because there might have been 500 cases of absentee fraud. There probably were 10 of in-person fraud. That's almost never happens. But as you can see, it's still vanishingly rare among mail-in ballots. So rare, in fact, says the Brennan Center, and I trust them because I used to work for them. Quote, it is still more likely for an American to be struck by lightning than to commit mail voting fraud. Okay? So that's what we're talking about. But nevertheless, you know, you see it in the news, and you see really scary stories about the level of polarization and the kind of activism that has continued out of this persistent story about fraud, and in particular, the story that the 2020 presidential election was stolen, right? That's a very persistent story that very many millions of our fellow Americans believe and are acting on. This is a kind of threat to democracy and to your vote counting that I don't know what we need to do about. But it's pretty clear to me we need to do something, or we're fighting the last war instead of the one that really is on the horizon. So this is something that I think we all have to think about. What are the few things that I can come up with? Well, for one thing, support your local news services if there are any. For another thing, do everything you can to stay informed on a local level, right? Particularly in local elections, it's often possible to, and in Pennsylvania, I know this is true, to get to personally know the candidates and the people who are running those, organizing those campaigns, and you can judge for yourself. You don't have to listen. This is another thing that's happened. Local politics has been really co-opted by a lot of national and even international voices. It's no longer a from the ground up game in a lot of cases. It's stuff being fed from big money on a national and international level. So the more you can go up from the bottom with information and then work for the candidates and for the issues that you think are important and spread the truth about them, the more you're fighting against this. Is that enough? I don't know. I will say that, you know, having sort of tried to mobilize this myself, I've worked recently for, you know, just like knocking doors for a couple of candidates who won, one in a general election, a state candidate, another in a federal primary, a primary for federal office. And I was gratified, having thought, well, this is a complete waste of time banging on all these doors for a few weekends. Each of them won that race by less than 1% of the vote. And it was then that I, you know, turned to my fellow friend who had gone with me in the rain and said, you know what, maybe it really mattered that we knocked on those doors and actually talked to people in person instead of them just getting the Facebook feed, right? So, you know, this is just my final pitch for democracy, not a spectator sport. And probably not something that we should be running on social media either, but actually in a contact way. And that's all I have.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So we now have plenty of time for questions. We have a mic. I don't know how far the mic is. Come to here. That's apparently how far the mic is.
I can do
Step
this.
right up.
I have two questions, so I'll just ask them both, and then maybe one is for each of you. I can't recall the counties during the primary, but I think Fayette County, not Allegheny County. There were some counties who did not ultimately certify. I mean, maybe they have by now. But what is that all about? Are they allowed to do that? And does that not kind of threaten democracy. The other question is, I got in my mailbox today a flyer from Mike Doyle, who we know is not the Mike Doyle, who is leaving Congress, but someone who is I think Republican, I don't even know. But is that misinformation? I mean, clearly that's his name,
Like it to me.
and that he's allowed to run, but I think that's misinformation, but I'd like to know if that's what can be done about something like that. I know things like that have happened in Florida and elsewhere. So there are my two questions. Thanks.
Go.
Well, I'll take the second one, although you're probably the more authority on both of them. But I don't think there's anything you can do about people who have names that are the same as current politicians who try to capitalize on that name recognition. It's misinformation in the sense, certainly I think it's misinformation in the sense that it's aimed at confusing voters. But it's the person's name, and they have every right to run for office as anybody else. So I don't think there's anything we can do about it, except, there are other ways to know that it's not the Mike Doyle that you like, it's the Mike Doyle you don't like. As you said, he probably is registered as a Republican, or it's going to be on the ballot as a Republican, though that may not always be true, so that may not always be helpful. And these kinds of things do happen. I mean, I've seen places where somebody with the same name will run in the same election, just on purpose to steal votes, so that a third candidate ends up with the plurality. So I mean, the only way I think to overcome something like that is to change our electoral system to something like ranked choice voting, which I'm all ears on.
Yeah. I mean, clearly it's misinformation, and it's clearly intentional misinformation, right? I mean, they're running a tomato can with a name that's going to confuse people because of his name. Do I think you could win a fraud claim against it? No, mostly because of the kind of evidence that you'd have to bring. But does it meet the sort of, basic colloquial definition of fraud? Yeah. I mean, it seems like somebody's intentional fraud, but how are you going to prove it, right? As Jonathan says, he has a right to run for office. His name is Mike Doyle. Good enough, right? Could I suppose I could get, like a videotape that, gets leaked, and you see the leaders of the, Republican caucus saying, I got it. We're going to run this guy, Mike Doyle, because that's going to fool people, and they're going to believe him, blah, 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 blah. Would you maybe? Yeah, maybe, but you haven't got that. I mean, so I think what's unbelievable, frankly, and this has nothing to do with the law and everything to do with how petty politics gets, what's with the real Mike Doyle not coming out and saying something about it, right? Oh, guess what? It's because he doesn't like the person who's running against the fake Mike Doyle, right? That's all I can conclude. I don't know. I'm not on this. Maybe some of you know him. But if you do know him, like what I would say, the thing to do is get him, whether it's by persuasion and cupcakes or threats of public humiliation, to stand up and say, this isn't me, and you folks who think it is are misguided. On the people who are on the non-certification, I'm not familiar with the specific of those counties. I mean, yes, eventually, again, it's this my point about administration. There's of course it's their duty to certify those elections. Of course that's their job. And if they are not doing their job, then what recourse do we have? Well, doubtless there's some recourse administratively, there's some recourse legally. It's the same kind of, I don't know, again, the technicalities in that situation, but you begin to see, that's a sort of famous problem, right, that's in the news about an election administrator not doing their job. But then people have to sort out, well, who's got the will and the leverage and the, who's going to file that case, or who's going to go up the chain and get the person to do, that's what it takes when ultimately somebody's just like, no, I'm not doing it, right? Mm-hmm. Bartleby the Scrivener, I prefer not to. Then there's something that can be done, but I guarantee that stuff like that on a smaller level is happening all the time. Somebody's like, I'm just not going to do that, or I'm not going to do that. Well, that's why we need administrators who do their job.
I promise not to get too political, but I'm going to get a little bit political just for a second, and I want to add to what you just said. And one of the candidates for governor who appoints the Secretary of State in the state of Pennsylvania has already said that they're going to appoint somebody who will not accept election results. This will cause a constitutional crisis. And, so what do? We don't vote for candidates who are not pro-democracy is a good course of action. I think we should ask people, to be very forward about what their stance on democracy is, because I think that there's an element to our current politics that is anti-democratic, small d democratic, and it's scary. I don't know what the recourse is if the Secretary of State. It's a constitutional crisis. Maybe the U.S. Supreme Court.
Recourse, but again. At a certain point, I guess this gets to my third way that democracy gets threatened, and that is that unfortunately, I think those millions of people, now, not necessarily cynical candidates who are running on the fraudulent fraud squad idea, right? But the millions or tens of millions or, God forbid, more, who believe it and who would be voting for somebody because they say they won't certify election results. They think they're the champions of democracy. Remember that, right? It's not like they're like autocrats, bring on Mussolini, that's who we need. They believe a story, whether you think it's credible or not, about democracy that makes them the 1776 heroes, right? And so it's a bigger problem than just sort of making people say, well, do you believe in democracy or not? The people who stormed the Capitol were wearing red, white, and blue. That's the idea. So it's a real problem with how we get to a place where we can have some kind of agreed upon story that backs the democracy that we believe in.
I just want to add to that question. It isn't just in Pennsylvania. This is sort of around the nation, both secretaries of state and governors. Are there any administrative controls? I know, lawsuits can be brought. Is there anything that can prohibit, like a Mastriani, from saying, "This is my Secretary of State. We're not going to accept any of the votes. We're going to decide who won"?
Well, it's a violation of due process. So yes, there would be litigation. You probably heard, there's a couple of things out there. You've probably heard about the Electoral Count Act and some proposed amendments to it. That would be a really good idea because that's a piece of federal statutory law that has ambiguities in it that was part of the story back on January 6th about why the theory was that the vice president had the power to override the counting of the votes in Congress. That is false. It's false as he learned from lawyers at the time and thus refused to do it. It's false under that statute, and it would be unconstitutional, right? I think there's a broad consensus about that, but that doesn't mean that there can't be a story to the contrary. So the other thing that you might have heard of is the independent state legislature theory, and there's a big case at the Supreme Court called Moore that's up there. Now, there are many versions of independent state legislature, but one of them is a claim that the Supreme Court would say, well, it's the part of the United States Constitution that allows, that empowers state legislatures to set the rules for federal elections. By legislature, they meant legislature, unconstrained by the state constitution and unconstrained by the Supreme Court of the state. It's just up to the legislature, and you can picture what happens then in a gerrymandered state where the legislators are set free from the state constitution and the state court to do what they want, and the theory would be, oh, then they can override the election. I mean, I'm here to say that under the court's precedents would be unconstitutional as a matter of equal protection and due process and the First Amendment, and I think that even this United States Supreme Court would say so. So I don't think that is really going to be what will come of the independent state legislature theory, but something may come of it that could be very, very bad, and I can't promise you one way or the other.
I have a question. What percentage of potentially eligible voters in Pennsylvania would you consider as being apathetic? In other words, not really caring strongly about whether they voted or not. And the second question is, would these potentially apathetic voters skew more Republican, Independent, or Democrat?
This is a tough, I mean, it's an empirical question in some ways. I mean, with the right data, I guess we can sort of show what those percentages are. I said earlier that in 2018, only 51% of eligible voters participated in the election. So 49% are already apathetic and not voting. You know, it's gotten better. Right? More people voted in the 2020 election than ever before. And I think people who, I don't want to characterize people who actually cast a vote as apathetic. I mean, if they're casting a vote, I think they have some reason for doing it. But still, there are, even with high levels of turnout, we still have a lot of non-voters out there. And maybe it's apathy, maybe it's because they're busy or they've been disenfranchised because they're felons or for other reasons. I think the political science literature seems to suggest those who don't participate in elections tend towards Democrats. Like there's more that are Democratic than there are Republican. Republicans are more likely to participate. But other parts of our political science literature show that increased turnout doesn't seem to benefit either party. When turnout goes up, it kind of goes up across the board.
So I'll add to that a couple of things. First of all, my impression, and it's, you know, gossamer thin, my knowledge of political science literature, especially anything written in the last 10 years. But certainly when I worked for the Brennan Center and we looked at this, our conclusion was there is no way to know who those voters who are not voting would vote for. And it probably varies widely from place to place. So there's not a clear, there's not only not clear data, there's really very little with which to predict whether somehow getting all of those people to vote would be good for the Republicans or good for the Democrats. And about apathy, I have a couple things to say about this. One, my view on this has really changed in the last couple of years. Having been a voting rights lawyer and drunk the, you know, democracy, voting rights Kool-Aid, I have long been a big proponent of, you know, everybody should vote, and, you know, wearing those stickers and those T-shirts that say vote, and, you know, yelling at people who didn't vote, and talking about, in fact, I didn't actually publish it, but I almost wrote or published a paper suggesting that the United States ought to adopt mandatory voting. There are countries like Australia where if you don't vote, you get fined, right? And so I have a whole thing about mandatory voting and how that would be a good idea. But, you know, in the last couple of years, my mind has changed somewhat on this in the following way. Rather than talking about, you know, how people who don't vote are apathetic and ought to vote, I think we ought to think more about whether people are not engaged in the democratic process by voting in other ways because they really don't see it as something that represents them or could represent them. A lot of people who don't vote, white people, black people, rural people, urban people, look at who they are being asked to vote for and say, those people don't have a clue about my life or know anything or would be the least bit willing or able to see things in a way that they would be representative of me, right? So I I think it's a bigger job than sort of like registration. I'm all for registration tables, absolutely. Get everybody to register, and registrations don't necessarily mean votes, so turn out by all means, knock the doors. Part of how I changed my mind about this was by knocking doors and having people say to me, why should I vote? Who are you going to tell me to vote for? Who looks like me in that election? I don't think so. And can you show me somebody who's done something for me? So, I think we need to listen to the people who don't vote and ask them why, and talk about, what we could do to try to broaden the democratic choices.
If I could just throw a quick follow-up, is there any data that suggests that someone registered as one party or the other is more likely not to add a date to the back of an envelope?
Not that I know of. There's a follow-up there.
I just wanted to comment on that because I was really glad when you brought up misinformation, because it strikes me that the misinformation campaign is by far the largest problem we have right now, the biggest threat to our democracy, because it's nothing that any of us sitting here individually can control. The fact that there were Russian bots and still are, right, that there are outside governments interfering in our election, much less individual candidates committing fraud on a daily basis, right, is such a huge problem. And I think that even what you just said, this idea that has filtered into the general population, that there's apathy because candidates don't look like us, I feel like that is even part of the misinformation campaign that has been spread in the last maybe 10 to 15 years, maybe a little more. We've always had this sense of populism in this country, but certainly if you go back 50 years and something, most of our candidates have never looked like the average person, right? They have never had, FDR certainly did not have the life of the average person in the United States, right? And we weren't asking our politicians to look like us in the same way, right? That I think it's part of this idea that somehow, and Trump certainly doesn't look like any of these people, but somehow, committed. So I just think that I'm not saying that we shouldn't listen to people, but I think that the problem is so much deeper than that, right? That itself is something that's being spread as this idea that we shouldn't, we can't vote because people aren't listening to us, right? And we're disenfranchised and people aren't listening to us, right? That is becoming so much a part of our messaging too, that we have to be careful about accepting that at face value, right? And that's like, who is the person running within the state that the anti-campaign ads are that he's a professor is one of the negatives. Is it Deluzio? I can't remember, but I keep seeing these ads popping up, right? And because I'm married to a professor, right? I'm always joking. I'm like, oh, those dangerous professors, right? But it is also it's the canary in the coal mine, right? That is really scary, right? That they see that as obviously someone has looked at that carefully and sees that that's going to be threatening to people. And again, a professor, he's an elite. He doesn't speak for us. He's different, right? I think we have to be very careful ourselves about accepting that stuff at face value, because I think it's part of the misinformation campaign.
Do you guys remember in early Trump 2017, Kellyanne Conway and her alternative facts, I think it was? This is a huge problem though, right? Because it's that we can't even agree on basic premises anymore. That, we have our facts and you have your facts, and we just disagree about the facts. And so we can't even, we're at a point where it's almost like we can't even have a legitimate conversation because we can't agree on even the basics. I'm kind of thinking more a little bit about apathy. Again, I want to also remind maybe, part of the problem for us, at least those of us in academia, certainly, and those of us in these kind of communities, we're around people like right now, people are interested in politics. That's why you came to this, or you're interested in being informed about issues. Most people in America are not us, right? When you look at the data, most people know basically nothing about politics. It's interesting because we talk about how much polarization we have, but then when you ask people about politics, they don't know anything about it. They don't know anything about the issues. They don't have strong opinions on the issues. It's also, that itself is a challenge to democracy, and it makes it very easy to sort of fool people into believing things with their alternative facts and misinformation, because people just don't have a steady diet of politics. If you look at like ratings on Fox News, we think Fox News is a big problem because it's providing misinformation. Something like the top show has like 2 million viewers. There's 320 million people in the US. There's 170 million voters, or some numbers quite like that. Nobody's watching the news. Very few people are watching this news. More people are getting stuff on Facebook and these kinds of social medias. And so we have the problem of the targeted ads. But still, it's still ambiguous whether these are having a big effect on people's choices. The evidence seems to suggest that misinformation is actually not driving changes or causing people to vote in ways that they otherwise wouldn't. So I don't want to say it's not a problem, but the evidence so far, early evidence in political science, suggests that it's not as big of a problem as people fear.
So I think you raise a really important point about the intersection of misinformation and people sort of bowing out of the system, right? Out of the electoral system that we have. And again, I don't know what kind of empirical work there is out there that would support that and show that, but it stands to reason that with targeted ads, that the one way, to depress turnout is to convince people that there's no one worth voting for them, right? I do think it's a really complicated issue, and that it's not all one or another. So, for example, you mentioned FDR, a famously populist, famously popular amongst working class, and brought us Social Security and the Works Progress Administration and good things for the working man, right? Not so much, and about housing, the beginning of the Federal Housing Authority, all right. Not so good for Black Americans, FDR, right? I mean, so there's a lot of stuff out now that you can see about how the Federal Housing Administration were the ones who started redlining. They were the ones who provided public housing for working class and middle class white people and absolutely deliberately fenced out Black Americans. So there's a very deep history in this country of there really being people who are touted as the person you should vote for, who turn around and didn't represent you, right? At the same time, there's also, there are all kinds of assumptions about apathy. So like one of the groups that are often, there are very low voting rates among people with previous criminal convictions, even in states where they're allowed to register and vote, right? So back when I worked on this issue, I saw a lot of scholarship about how apathetic, how it didn't really matter whether, they could or could not vote because they weren't going to vote anyway. There was a bunch of empirical stuff. Well, so we did this was in New York State at the time. We did a study of local county election districts. There were, I forget how many in New York, 30, something like that. There's a lot. And I had law students call them all up. Well, what happened, what precipitated this study was I got a call from a person who said, I'm up in Harlem, I'm tabling registration, and I have a guy here, a bunch of guys here, who say, I can't vote, I have a criminal conviction. I say, are they on parole? Which would be very unlikely in 2002 or whatever. No, they're not on parole. They served their time, they're done. But they say they can't register. I was like, no, they're just wrong. Under New York law, they can register. They're just misinformed, okay? I mean, I was like, this isn't very interesting. I'm fighting this great big national voting rights case about, Florida. It's in the New York Times. These people up there are just confused. Forget about it, right? Well, I later learned that I was the one who was confused and misinformed because after a certain amount of work and repeated calls, we started getting information that there were people in New York with criminal convictions who were trying to register, and by the way, this was in liberal democratic places, including all 5 boroughs of New York City, and being turned away by local election administrators who said, oh, you can't do that unless you get a, and they had names for these like official documents that they said you had to have. And I was like, what is that? I mean, I'd never heard of that, but I don't know much about state law. I got my intern, go, search this out for me. Look in the regs. I need to know what they call this like a certificate of, I forget what. So the student goes and looks and comes back. Sorry, I can't find it. What do you mean you can't find it? Get in there and find it. I need to know that. I need to see this thing. What's wrong with you? Didn't they teach you how to do research at school? And come back, no, sorry, we couldn't find it. I'm like, oh, right, I'll look, And I'm like, there is no such thing. They're asking for a document that doesn't exist in order to enfranchise these people. And so then we had students call every county election district in the state, and more than half of them were, if it wasn't that document, it was like, oh, I need a notarized letter from the judge who sentenced you. Oh, I need a this. Oh, I need a that. It was all this stuff that they just didn't know what they were doing. I don't think they were even deliberately disenfranchising. They were just like, these people, it can't be right that they can just vote again. So all this stuff about the people who were in prison who didn't care about voting, and me with like, they're just wrong, they can register. P.S., they were right. They knew more about the law in action than I did. They were right. They couldn't register because the administrators were doing a lousy job. So, you have to sort of look beneath the immediate surface of these things, and so, claims of people's apathy.
Earlier today on CNN,
Oh, God.
they were talking how Fetterman has to take Philadelphia, and then they were interviewing people, and whenever they were interviewing people, there were 2 ladies that said, I can't get by his appearance, how he's dressed. So how much does appearance take into consideration?
I know, put on a suit, John. Like, what's your problem? I don't know, right?
I'm not an expert on political communication. Things matter. I mean, so actually I was thinking about this earlier today. Remember Hillary Clinton back in the 90s, or maybe 90s, in the pantsuit? Like, how do women dress for politics? And I was thinking about that. I don't know why it came up in my brain, but I thought, it's been a challenge, for women to enter politics. I mean, they weren't in politics before 1919, and still are not in politics at any high rates. And you didn't ask about women in politics, but appearance clearly matters. So what people wear clearly has an effect. But I think Fetterman might have this other idea that looking more like a working class person may make it more able to garner votes from, say, working class white voters who moved decidedly towards Trump in 2016 and 2020, while still getting his base of voters who are going to mark D because they don't want Dr. Oz. So I don't know that we could say with authority that it's going to work one way or the other. I could see it actually working towards his advantage in some places.
I mean, I'm not an expert at all on the political science of appearance, and I'm sure there's some, and politics, I'm sure there's some empirical stuff out there. I mean, a couple of things that I've heard and you could think about. I mean, I've heard that there's an empirical claim that Taft never could have been elected as president because he was so obese that these days he could never get elected now as president, but back in the day that wasn't such a knock against you in the first place. In the second place, there was no TV, right? So, and then famously also FDR hid his disability, or
well, the journalists, I think what's interesting too is the journalists
they went along with it.
participated in that.
That's right.
Right, there was more of a sense of this wasn't something that would cover, and they famously say too that Nixon lost
Yeah, the
because
debate.
it was the first televised debates, and he sweated so profusely, and JFK was so much better looking.
Yeah.
So it's been around for a while.
Presidents tend to be taller on average, so being tall matters in politics.
Pockets, right,
So, you know, one hopes that those are marginal, relatively, factors, but I don't know the.
Well, this is, again, going back to apathy and what voters know. Voters don't know issues. And so politicians or potential politicians are running campaigns as beauty contests, not as, these are the policy choices that I have and you should vote for me because I have the similar policy choices. It's who would I much rather have a beer with? This is an issue that I'm not sure how we address. I mean, I think we all would want to have a more deliberative democracy where issues matter. But how do you, I mean, the idea of having mandatory voting works the opposite, because those who are not voting are the least informed, and those who are voting are at least marginally more informed. And I certainly would never advocate for having some kind of literacy test or trivia test to vote in politics. So we've done that, and it doesn't work. It's a bad system. So.
And I'm not sure professors should be at the top of it.
We are getting close on time, but if I could, because you mentioned that again, people watching the news would have seen the proportional voting, whatever this happened in Alaska.
Ranked choice voting.
Ranked choice voting. Can you give us a 2-minute primer on what the heck that is?
Sure. And I'm not an advocate of ranked choice voting, so I'll say that, but I'm also not against it. So we're all basically familiar with our plurality single-member district system that most states use, where the person who wins the people they run the primary, they go to the general election. Sometimes it's Democrat, Republican, sometimes there's a Libertarian or some other third or fourth, fifth party. And whoever gets the most votes wins. So you cast one vote for one person for each election, and whoever gets the most, even if it's not a majority. A ranked choice voting system is what you might consider it's an electoral system, a voting rule that tries to get to a consensus. So you don't just cast one vote, you actually rank all of the candidates on the ballot by your preference. So if there are 3 candidates, you may prefer, say, the Democrat first, and then you might actually like the Libertarian second, and only the Republican last, because you're just not a fan. Or, you can imagine many different combinations of your own preferences. And what ranked choice voting does is it tries to say, who are the consensus candidates? Like, not necessarily who gets the most first place votes, but who are most people agreeable to. And one of the reasons why some of us believe that ranked choice voting offers a promise for a better democracy is because we believe that it will tend towards candidates who are much more moderate than what we're getting in the plurality system. It additionally has this benefit of you being able to cast your vote for somebody who's not of the major 2 parties, and it not being wasted or spoiled. So a classic example of where a spoil affected an election is the 2000 election. And the decisive state in the 2000 election was Florida, won by George Bush after lots of lawsuits and all these other things, but by 527 votes. And Ralph Nader got hundreds of thousands of votes, if I remember correctly, and most of those voters would have preferred Al Gore over George Bush. And so if we had a ranked choice voting, people could have voted for Ralph Nader 1, and then Al Gore 2, and then George Bush 3. And if that had been in place at the time, almost certainly we would have had an ex-president Al Gore.
Thanks. I just wanted to make a few more suggestions about the issue of information. Pittsburgh not having a daily newspaper that appears on the stands every day, although you can get it online. No, there are things online like Public Source, for example, and also the League of Women Voters sponsors a lot of forums in which 2 candidates get to debate with each other, more or less. And they also have an online space where they ask questions to the candidates who are running, and their answers are recorded. So you can go to that website of the League of Women Voters of Pittsburgh or of Pennsylvania, and you can get a lot of information about the candidates that way. And there are little plastic bags with lots of stuff from the League of Women Voters sitting around various tables in this room and in the room we're going to for the social hall. So I just want to direct your attention to that, and if you have any comments on that, feel free to mention.
Well, just one comment on the decline of local newspapers. Either Joe or Jesse brought it up earlier. The decline of local newspapers, the numbers are staggering. Local newspapers have disappeared. I mean, even like you said, Pittsburgh doesn't even have a daily print paper anymore. And not everybody can get their news online, so it creates a new kind of problem. But the decline in local news has been associated clearly with increased corruption in local government. Journalists are really a critically important part of ensuring accountability of our politicians. And so I double the thought of supporting your media. And there are other good sources of news. I love Spotlight PA is really great. They do a very good job. And there are some other smaller papers around the state. But it's hard because I want to read all the news and I have to subscribe to 15 different newspapers to do it, and it gets quite expensive.
And a big thumbs up to the League, who for decades have been providing nonpartisan information about the candidates, but especially about election structures, where you can find your polling place, all those things. They've done a great job, and they've been on the right side of a lot of litigation as well.
Jonathan, can you speak to the impact of the disappearance of political conventions and the rise of primaries in terms of the kind of candidates that we now have running for office?
I should have finished my reading for class tomorrow, which is a paper called On the Theory of Parties, and it at least touches on this issue. The evolution of primaries means that, well, first of all, we have closed primary in Pennsylvania, and if you know what that means, it means that if you're a Democrat, you can vote in the Democratic primary, you're a Republican, you vote in the Republican primary, and if you're an independent like myself, you get disenfranchised from the primaries, and so we get stuck with whatever candidates that make it through. Actually, ranked choice voting is a solution to that problem as well. Well, so you could the system could be set up differently in different places. In Alaska, you have a election that is, I believe it's just like a plurality, and the top 4 vote getters move on to the second stage, the general election. So it's sort of an open primary. California does something very similar, top 2 primary. And so you vote not for party, you vote for just the candidates that you want, and the 2 that emerge at the top then run against each other in the general election. So conventions used to be where we selected our nominees. And one reason why that may have been a better way of choosing candidates is that parties often have different incentives than individual voters. And when you have these closed primary systems where only the most engaged citizenry, because again, most people know very little about politics, and we can only get 50% of eligible voters to vote in a general election that's important or salient. To get people to vote in primary elections, it's much lower, much lower percentages. And they tend to be the most engaged and the most extreme. And so the most extreme elements of our society are those who are choosing our candidates. And we used to have these conventions prior to, I guess 1968 was sort of the end of the reform, the popular reform to move towards a direct election primary. But they had different incentives. Parties want to win elections. They don't want to be ideologically extreme. And so they would nominate candidates who were towards what we as political scientists call the median voter, i.e. the people in the middle. And so you would have candidates that were actually very similar on issues, and we just don't have that anymore. And it may be one reason why we see the kinds of polarization in our politics, at least in Congress and in our state legislatures.
Maybe one final question?
A disclaimer before I make this comment that I have, in all the many years I have been voting, I've never missed an election. Okay. However, I am completely skeptical, and this has to do with apathy. If you have a system where a person who has more popular votes than the person who wins the election, how can you not say, oh, what the hell does it matter whether I vote?
I can't even comment because I agree. I mean, this is the problem with partisan gerrymandering, is that you end up with a result where the majority chooses one party and they get stuck with the different party running their government.
Well, it's also the problem with the Electoral College.
Yeah. Well, that's what I wrote my dissertation on.
There you go.
And again, ranked choice voting that's one solution to fix these problems, because then we want our elections to be majoritarian, that the majority rules. And when you have these electoral systems where they're plurality based, you oftentimes get what we might call a reversal or an inversion of the winner. It turns out that this problem is not getting better, it's actually getting worse in the Electoral College. It's more likely that we're going to have more of those inversions in the future, at least until there's sort of a realignment of our elections where some states become more democratic, like Texas and Georgia. But until that happens, this is going to become a more serious problem. And, given the misinformation and discrediting of elections, you can only imagine what would happen if once again we have a popular vote reversal in 2024. And we've already seen violence at the Capitol. I think Jessie said before we started that civil war could happen, or somebody told me civil war could happen.
I didn't say
that wasn't you. I hope not.
I'm not saying
I hope not.
but I didn't.
But the potential for more violence is a serious threat.
So why don't we end with sort of the calls to action, and I'll see how good of a student I was, and you might be able to help me out. So what we can actually do most immediately is, first of all, register, is that the right verb, to be a poll worker? And is there still time to do that?
There is, and you'd be surprised those of you who've done it, you know that Allegheny County is perennially short of poll workers. They first ask people who are repeaters to come back, and then there's a lot of sort of back and forth, and are they coming or not? But up till days before the election, they often have positions all around that are not filled. And if you want to be available for that, you can go online to Allegheny County's website and sign up. You can also try calling if you prefer to do it by phone to the county election office. Someone's raising his hand back.
On that particular point, I saw some numbers just last week that they only got about 2/3 of what they need.
So this is
I'll just add this because you might got to be on the mic that Brian said that recently he saw only 2/3 of the positions open as county poll workers have been filled. Did I catch that right?
Yeah, definitely no more than 2/3.
And real quickly, AlleghenyVotes.com is where you want to go to sign up and get information on that.
Very good. AlleghenyVotes.com.
And also, just so you know, be prepared if you fill this out, sign up, or call. You're not going to hear something right away, probably. Like the wheels grind exceedingly slow, and it might be like a week still. You're thinking the election's coming up, but hang in there. Try calling back. I did this recently, and it took a while, but indeed I was called, and I wound up being a judge of elections, a person running a polling place, though I had never been a poll worker, in an election district very far from my home, but because I said I'll go anywhere. And again, certainly in every place that I've lived and voted, it's not just Pennsylvania, election workers tend to be older people, excellent, because we have a lot of experience. But why should it be limited to that? There's this kind of culture of it now. And I have convinced law students now to do it. I got about 20 law students to do it in the last election. And I'm on something of a campaign to get younger people into this as well. So if you know younger people, if you're related to younger people, some of whom might like to be paid $150 for a day, get them involved.
Okay, so one is register as a poll worker. Two, support local journalism. And there were a number of venues that were mentioned here. There was a third. What was that third?
I don't know.
Oh, the canvassing.
So, like,
And that
once you know who and what you want to support, like,
that actually canvassing, it sounds like can be personally rewarding. You can learn things, and you can actually see what some of the real challenges are for not only getting people registered, but actually maybe motivating them to actually show up on election day. Okay. So let's have a round of applause and thank our invite people back or
Oh, just go ahead. Okay. If you go out that door and follow the hallway, there is a little reception out there, and these guys will be out there, so you'll get a chance to ask them additional questions. Okay? Thank you guys so much. So very much.